When George III ascended the British throne, the world saw only a young king draped in velvet and gold. But behind that crown lay a fire of fierce determination to turn Britain into the most powerful empire in human history. His reign unfolded during a storm of rebellion, revolution, and relentless ambition. From the rise of America to the thunder of Napoleonic cannons, George III stood at the center of the world's greatest political battlefield. L'Obedbimani, hated by others and misunderstood by history, he ruled through chaos with a stubborn resolve that shaped nations and forged a superpower. Yet beneath the iron facade lay a man plagued by doubt, burdened by family conflict, and haunted by the one war he could not win. A prince shaped by destiny, George William Frederick was born on June 4, 1738, in London's Norfolk House, a small, almost modest beginning for a prince destined to change the world. His early life was unusual for a future king. Unlike many royal heirs raised by distant tutors and cold palace walls, George grew up in a household centered on discipline, faith, and family affection. His mother, Princess Augusta, was fiercely protective, determined to mold him into a moral, upright monarch. George must be a king of virtue, she often whispered, believing the future of Britain depended on him. From childhood, George was thoughtful and introspective. He wasn't charmed by extravagance or court gossip. Instead, he preferred books, science, experiments, and quiet walks in nature. He studied mathematics, astronomy, law, geography, Latin, and the Constitution, subjects that would later define his worldview. By age 10, he could read and write in multiple languages. By 14, he was already analyzing political documents with the seriousness of a grown statesman. Yet, beneath this disciplined education lay tension. Augusta shielded him from many court influences, creating a wedge between George and others who believed a prince should learn through exposure, not isolation. His grandfather, King George II, rarely acknowledged him. The court whispered that the young prince was too quiet, too serious, too sheltered. But Augusta insisted that a king did not need charm, he needed strength. When George was 12, tragedy struck. His father, Frederick, Prince of Wales, died suddenly, thrusting young George into the role of heir. The loss devastated him, shaping his temperament and fueling his desire to be everything his father was not. Responsible, steadfast, and loyal to duty, he vowed to become a different kind of king, one who served God, family, and country above all else. As he approached adulthood, his character was evident: moral, stubborn, principled, and hard-working. He did not wish to be a puppet king, nor a flamboyant ruler consumed by vanity. He wanted to rule with purpose. At 18, he fell deeply in love with Lady Sarah Lennox, a spirited and beautiful young noblewoman. Their romance blossomed quietly, full of innocence and hope. But love was not a luxury for those born to rule. His mother forbade the relationship. Sarah was charming, but not political enough, not royal enough, not safe enough for a future king whose every step carried consequences for the empire. Heartbroken but obedient, George ended the courtship. The moment marked the first great conflict of his life, the battle between personal desire and royal duty, a battle he would face again and again. In 1760, fate arrived. George II died, and at just 22 years old, George III ascended the throne. As he addressed Parliament for the first time, he declared the words that stunned Britain and signaled a new era. Born and educated in this country, I glory in the name of Britain. To the making of an empire. When George III took the throne in 1760, the British Empire stood at a crossroads, powerful but fragile, victorious yet stretched thin. The 7 Years' War was raging across continents, devouring money and men. Britain had won spectacular battles overseas, expanded territory, and secured global influence. But the empire's foundation was cracking under financial strain. George III inherited not only a crown but the heavy weight of imperial responsibility. A young king versus an old system. The British political world George entered was dominated by powerful aristocrats and long-entrenched factions. Many ministers believed the young king would be easy to control. They assumed he would follow their lead, sign their papers, approve their decisions, and preserve the status quo. They were wrong. George had no intention of being a ceremonial figure. He wanted to govern to restore unity, moral discipline, and order to a fractured political system. His determination to assert royal authority shocked both allies and enemies. He replaced ministers he did not trust, elevated new voices, and insisted on a monarchy that was active, not ornamental. This boldness made him enemies among the political elite. Whigs accused him of trying to become a tyrant. Supporters praised him as a king reclaiming rightful authority. The tension between crown and parliament became a defining feature of his rule, a marriage for the empire. In 1761, George married Princess Charlotte of Mecklenburg-Strelitz, 17-year-old German princess he had never met. Their first conversation lasted just minutes. Their marriage lasted nearly 60 years. Unlike many political unions of the era, theirs grew into a warm, stable partnership. Charlotte was intelligent, calm, modest, and deeply supportive. She avoided political interference, allowing George to rule without domestic conflict. Together, they had 15 children, the largest royal family in British history. Their marriage strengthened the monarchy in the eyes of the public. At a time when European courts were infamous for scandal, mistresses, and intrigue, George III became known as the faithful king, devoted to his wife and children. This moral image helped bind the monarchy to the hearts of ordinary Britons, reinforcing the idea that the royal family was not only powerful, but also virtuous. The empire expands under George III's early reign. Britain emerged from war as the world's dominant superpower. The empire stretched across North America, the Caribbean, parts of Africa, India, and beyond. British ships ruled the seas. Trade flourished. Scientific innovation accelerated. It looked like the dawn of a golden age. 3. The American War. A king under fire. The first shots of the American Revolution echoed across the world in April 1775. At Lexington and British redcoats and colonial militia clashed in a violent spark that ignited one of the most consequential wars in human history. For George III, it was more than a rebellion. It was a direct challenge to the authority of the crown and the unity of an empire he believed must never break. The die is now cast. When George learned of the battles, he wrote a sentence that defined his stance. The die is now cast. The colonies must either submit or triumph. He saw the conflict not as a local revolt, but as a dangerous precedent. If America broke free, what would stop other colonies from doing the same? India, the Caribbean, Africa. An empire could not survive if each part could walk away whenever they disagreed. George was not bloodthirsty. He did not seek war for glory, but he believed deeply, almost spiritually, that the monarchy and parliament were legitimate, lawful authorities. To surrender without a fight would be to betray every soldier who had died defending the empire. And so, the war began. Across the Atlantic, the struggle for control of the early years of the conflict seemed promising for Britain. The empire had unmatched naval power, professional armies, global resources. The colonists were divided, undertrained, and poorly supplied. But they had something more powerful than any fleet. A belief in their own cause, inspired by firebrand leaders like Washington, Franklin, and Jefferson. Battles like Bunker Hill proved the Americans would not be easily crushed. The British won, but at a brutal cost. George watched as the conflict escalated far beyond what anyone expected. He read military reports late into the night, pored over maps, exchanged letters with generals, and followed every movement of the war with intense focus. He was determined, but not reckless. Firm, but not blind. To him, America was not simply land, it was the future of the empire. The turning point. Saratoga 1777 brought a devastating blow. The British defeat at Saratoga shifted global opinion. France, Britain's longtime rival, saw an opportunity and joined the Americans. Soon, Spain and the Dutch Republic followed. George III suddenly faced a world war. British resources were stretched across continents. The Navy struggled to defend every front. The treasury buckled under enormous strain. 4. Shadows of the Crown. Madness, power, and the age of empire. The OS of America carved a deep wound into the heart of Britain and into the mind of King George III. Yet instead of breaking him, the defeat awakened an unexpected strength, a determination to rebuild the empire stronger than before, no matter the personal cost. But as Britain expanded, George's own mind began to betray him. This is the chapter where the king fought not against foreign armies, but against something far more terrifying himself. A kingdom reeling, a king reforged by 1783. Britain was politically fractured. Public anger simmered. Parliament was in chaos. Critics claimed the monarchy was losing relevance, but George III refused to fade into the background. Instead of retreating into ceremony, he stepped directly into politics, guiding the rebuilding of the empire with a level of involvement rarely seen in British kings. He pushed Parliament toward economic reform. He strengthened the navy. He supported exploration missions that expanded British influence into the Pacific. He backed the East India Company, allowing Britain to tighten its grip on India. Soon the jewel of the empire. In those years, George became a symbol of resilience, a king underestimated, mocked, yet rising from failure with iron determination. But beneath this resurgence, there were cracks. Cracks no one wanted to see. The first signs of madness, it began quietly. Sleepless nights, uncontrollable energy, disturbing bursts of speech where his words tumbled out faster than his thoughts. At first, the court dismissed it as stress. After all, he was a king, carrying an empire on his shoulders. But soon the symptoms grew impossible to ignore. George began talking for hours without pause. He repeated prayers until his voice trembled. He wrote letters in frantic bursts, ink splattering across the page in wild patterns. At times, he was painfully aware of what was happening. "I fear my mind may desert me," he whispered once to Queen Charlotte. She held his hand, but inside she broke. She loved him deeply. Despite the enormous distance their royal roles created, watching him unravel was a burden she would carry in silence for years. The collapse in 1788, the darkness finally consumed him. During a public event, George suddenly began shouting uncontrollably, his thoughts disjointed, his eyes wild. He was rushed back to the palace, where doctors attempted treatments so brutal they bordered on torture restraints. Isolation, blistering ointments. The king who once commanded armies was now fighting hallucinations and terror inside his own mind. The royal household panicked. Parliament panicked. The entire empire seemed poised to fall apart again. With the king incapacitated, the nation faced a constitutional crisis. Should the Prince of Wales become regent and rule in his father's place? The political world erupted into factions. Some supported the prince, charismatic, extravagant, eager for power. Others defended George, insisting he would recover. Britain was suddenly a kingdom divided between a king who could not rule and an heir too impatient to wait. A shocking recovery then. Against all expectation, George recovered. 5. The final years. A kingdom without its king. By the winter of 1811, Britain faced a sorrowful and unprecedented reality. The empire was growing, but its king had disappeared into the shadows of his own mind. George III, once the steady hand of the monarchy, the leader who guided Britain through wars, reforms, and revolutions, was now king, in name only. The halls of Windsor grew quieter, the windows darkened, and the once busy royal chambers fell under a silence that felt almost sacred. Inside those rooms lived a man who no longer recognized the world he had shaped. A palace of ghosts. As George's insanity deepened, he became trapped between fragments of memory and confusion. He wandered the rooms of Windsor Castle, murmuring prayers, singing hymns, or speaking to people who were no longer there. He asked servants where Queen Charlotte had gone, even when she was sitting only a few rooms away. Some days he mistook his daughters for childhood figures. Other days he did not know them at all. And yet, despite the torment, there were moments of heartbreaking clarity. Once, a servant found him staring out a window as snow fell quietly across the palace grounds. When asked what he wished for, the king whispered, "I only want my mind back. I want to serve again." But the mind that had weathered war, rebellion, and betrayal would never fully return. The nation moves on while George faded from public view. The empire marched forward. Under the Regency Act, his eldest son ruled as Prince Regent, embracing power with extravagance and indulgence. Lavish parties, gambling, affairs. The regent poured his energy into pleasure rather than policy. And yet, the monarchy remained strong. Why? Because the public still remembered George III's decades of stability. His long reign had become a comforting symbol of continuity. To the British people, he was the farmer king, the stable father figure they trusted. Even as he vanished from royal life, his influence endured. The kingdom forged in his image while the king suffered in silence. The world around him transformed into something he had helped build. Britain's navy dominated the seas. Industrial growth exploded in cities across the nation. India expanded under British control. Napoleon fell and Europe crowned Britain the leading global superpower. And yet George III, the monarch who had guided Britain through the rise of this empire, never saw its final triumph. He lived in perpetual twilight, unaware that his decisions had reshaped the world. Grief upon grief. If fate had been kinder, the king might have spent his final years surrounded by the comfort of his family. Instead, tragedy followed him. In 1818, Queen Charlotte, his loyal companion of over 50 years, died. She had stood by him through war, madness, scandal, and heartbreak. Her death shattered the last fragile connection George had to reality. When the news was gently shared with him, he simply looked up with empty eyes. "She has left me," then, he said quietly, and sank back into confusion. His daughters, who adored him, visited often. They sat by his side, read to him, held his hand, but the king rarely recognized them. The man who had been father, husband, warrior, ruler, was now a shadow. The king's last dawn. George III spent his final days in Windsor Castle, attended by physicians and loyal servants. He no longer spoke coherently, Ebarelier. His once bright blue eyes dimmed, clouded by blindness and sorrow. On January 29, 1820, as a pale winter sun rose over the castle, the king took his last breath. No grand speeches, no final royal declaration. Just a quiet departure from a world he had shaped more deeply than he ever knew. He died holding a small piece of fabric, part of Queen Charlotte's dress. The last reminder of the life he once lived. Conclusion. The legacy of King George III. The monarch who shaped a superpower